I once had one of those moments that shakes your sense of security regarding neighbors. I was 25 at the time, living in a quiet neighborhood where I thought everybody looked out for each other. My neighbor who lived next door to me, let's call him Mike, was a middle-aged man in his 40s. He was friendly enough, and I would invite him to parties, and he would join, occasionally bringing a six-pack or two. He had a son in the army, and we shared some light conversations about military life and local news. Really no warning signs that I could think of. One night, I had planned to go to a friend's house, but I forgot something that I was supposed to bring with me. After having just left my house, I had to turn back. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw a figure jumping over my fence from out of my backyard. I slowed down, watching closely. The figure darted behind Mike's barn, which was just a few feet from my yard. I sat in my car, waiting, unsure of what to do. After a moment, I got out, feeling an odd mix of anger and fear. After the person stayed hidden behind the barn, I got out of the car telling the person to reveal themselves, saying that I had a loaded firearms with me, which was actually a bluff since it was inside my house. In response, I saw Mike's silhouette rushing towards his back door. I knew it was him, and I could only think of what he might have been doing. I walked up to his front door and knocked. He opened the door with a look of confusion, asking what was going on. I confronted him about being in my backyard and what in the world he was doing back there. He still played the confused part, saying he had been inside all night long. I wasn't too mad at first and tried telling him that if he ever wanted to hang out, just call me and ask or come knock on the door. However, Mike stayed in denial and began yelling insults and slurs at me. I think he was drunk too. No idea what he was doing jumping over my fence, but I knew for a fact it had been him, so I wasn't going to take any risks in the future. I told him that I kept my firearms close inside the house, and if I ever heard somebody attempting to enter my house, I wouldn't hesitate to shoot. After that night, he never spoke to me again. He also began watching me more closely than normal. I would see him peering out from behind his curtains, and every time I'd arrive back home from somewhere, I'd be nervous that Mike would be inside my house. Months later, he moved away, and it was a relief to not have to worry about my neighbor anymore. It was 2 a.m. one night, and I had a friend over at my house, and we were still awake and talking. We suddenly heard loud noises coming from outside, and my friend joked that maybe somebody was breaking into my car. Unfortunately, she was dead on. When we went to look out the window, we had a clear view, but the darkness obscured the details. My friend tried to get a good picture of the people breaking into my car while I ran to my phone, which was charging in a different room, to call the cops. When I arrived back at the window from my call with the cops, my friend relayed to me everything that I had missed. She said that she saw two men wearing hooded sweatshirts and dark clothing. They had torn apart my car, prying open the doors and breaking windows, tearing apart all my belongings that were inside. After a bit, one of the thieves had run off, leaving the other thief behind, who was still vandalizing the car after scattering stuff from inside my car all over the ground. Just then, I noticed my neighbor's car pulling out of his garage. The other thief eventually ran away, and as we waited for the cops to arrive, I wondered if my neighbor had seen anything as he was getting ready to leave his house. We filed a police report showing them the pictures that my friend had taken of the people. They said they would look into it, and then they left. As we were heading back inside my house upset, my neighbor's car returned and parked in his garage. I pointed it out to my friend as he was driving by, and I asked if it would be rude to go and ask my neighbor if he had seen anything since it was the middle of the night still. My friend's expression shifted and rushed me into the house. She went on to explain that my neighbor who had arrived home had been one of the men breaking into my car. She was certain of it, We had briefly seen my neighbor's outfit as he walked into his house, and it matched the blurry photo from earlier. He was wearing the same dark hoodie. Not only that, but from inside my house, we watched as he stepped out of his car and walked straight across the street to my house. We peered out from around a dark corner as he approached the living room window and looked inside my house. Then he walked back to his house, casually, as if nothing had happened. I called the cops back immediately, saying that my neighbor was the one who had been vandalizing my car. When the cops returned, they knocked on his door. He didn't answer, even though we knew he was there. After a few minutes, the officers walked back to us, saying there was nothing more they could do tonight, and they'd keep an eye on him. Later that morning, after not much sleep, I peered through window again. There was a note on my car now. All the note said was, "Call me," with a number on there. I wanted to call him and rage at him over the phone, but my friend convinced me not to call since it probably wasn't a good idea. After some digging on Google of his number and address, I discovered that he was a faculty member at one of the top schools in our city. I visited the police station multiple times throughout the next month, hoping for updates, but nothing happened. I tried to avoid looking at our neighbor whenever he was outside, watering his plants or tending to his yard. What's creepy is that he has to know that I know he did it. I'm not sure how the police haven't been able to do anything about it, especially with all the information I've given them. Maybe he bribed them. I really don't know. I just have to live by this guy now who did this to me, and I have no idea why he did. I've never even talked to him, or did anything that I would know to upset him prior to the incident. When I was younger, we had a situation with our neighbor that scared me a lot. It was about 15 years ago, and I was 9 years old, sick with a fever that kept me tossing and turning all night. My parents let me sleep in their bed so they could keep an eye on me. I remember staring at the digital clock that projected the time onto the ceiling. I must have drifted off again because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake. The doorbell rang. It was 3 loud chimes, and then came 3 heavy thumps on the front door. It was dark, and when I glanced up, the clock read 5 a.m. I wasn't sure if I dreamed it, or if it was real, but I instantly got nervous as I heard my parents sit up and whisper, "Was that the door?" Suddenly, a wave of fear washed over me. Who would be ringing the door at this time? My mind thought of stories that I had heard about burglars who knocked to lure homeowners into opening the door and then going inside. The knocking and ringing of the doorbell continued, with the knocking getting louder and louder. Our front door did not have a peephole, and the window was frost glass, so you couldn't see anything out of it at night. My dad got up and headed down the stairs. The banging continued, and I was glad that my dad didn't open the door. Instead, he shouted out asking who was there. There was no answer, however, and the relentless ringing and pounding continued. My brothers and I, who are wide awake now, tried to look from upstairs windows, but we didn't have a good view of the front door. My dad finally dialed 911, and I listened as he spoke to the operator. The banging finally stopped, just as I heard the police cars pull up outside, and I hoped that they would be able to catch whoever had been trying to break into our house. As I looked through the window, though, I felt confused, but also a little relieved. Instead of 1 police car, there were 4, plus 2 fire trucks. I remember wondering why the fire trucks needed to come. After what felt like a small eternity, my dad came upstairs to explain the whole situation. The old lady next door had woken up, convinced that she smelled smoke. She panicked, ran out of her house, and banged on our door for help. Because she was hard of hearing, she didn't hear my dad shouting. She had also called the police and fire department in her panic. The fire crew had checked her house and found no fire, just the lingering smell of her cigarette smoke. There was no intruder and no break-in, thankfully, but I remember being more scared than I ever had been in my life during those 10 minutes of banging on door, thinking that an intruder was going to break in the door and kill me or something. I had lived in our quiet neighborhood for years, so when a new family moved in next door, it was a little bit exciting. They seemed normal. It was a mother and father with 2 kids and a golden retriever. I welcomed them with a plate of cookies, and they seemed friendly. We exchanged small talk about the weather and neighborhood events every now and then. I eventually began having concerns about something going on in their backyard, though. There was this awful smell which kept getting stronger and stronger. At first, I thought it was just a backyard barbecue. The family often had friends over, and the scent of grilled meat would be through the air. But it kept growing stronger. It reminded me of something decaying, but I tried to ignore it. As the weeks went by, the smell coming from their yard got worse, and I found myself watching them more closely. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I was sitting on my porch, the smell stronger than ever, and I decided to take a walk. I approached their backyard, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was going on. The fence was high, but I could see through the slats. I was startled by what I saw. The kids were playing, but the parents stood together in a corner, pulling a tarp over something that looked like a compost bin in the corner of their yard. I thought maybe that might explain the smell, but I wondered why they would want to cover it with a tarp. About a week later, I saw their car pulling out of the garage. I thought nobody was home, so I went over to check the compost bin because the smell was still awful, and I wanted to know what food remnants would smell that bad. I slipped into their backyard as the smell hit me harder now, almost overwhelming. I approached the covered object, held my breath, and pulled back the tarp. It was a large rusted container, and inside I saw the remnants of what looked like many animals, just a bunch of bones and straps of fur of all sizes. I couldn't even fathom how many dead animals were in there, making the pile so large. As I left their backyard, I looked back and saw the mother of the family watching me with a serious blank face from one of the back windows. I thought that everyone had left in their car, but apparently the mother had been home the whole time watching me. I felt guilty about snooping around their yard, but what I had seen was so weird. I mean, they'd either been killing all these different types of animals or finding them dead as roadkill or something and bringing them back. Why in the world would they store dead animal carcasses in their backyard is beyond any reason I could think of. They could have been eating these animals, but it wasn't a major hunting season, and we didn't live in an area where the main type of sustenance was hunting animals. We lived in the suburbs, but we're in a big city. It definitely felt out of place. I thought about telling someone other than my family about it, but I'm not sure if something like that was even illegal or wrong. Anyways, the next time I was by their fence a couple of days later, I peeked through, and the whole container with the tarp covering, it was now gone and nowhere to be seen. I never viewed those neighbors as normal again. The summer block party was a yearly tradition on our street. It was a chance to catch up with neighbors, grill hot dogs, and let the kids run wild. That year, we had a new neighbor on the street. I never learned his first name, but he introduced himself as Mr. Grayson. He kept to himself, rarely coming out during the day. As we set up our tables and chairs that night for the block party, I noticed him standing in his yard watching us. I was wondering if he'd make an appearance at the block party since I never saw him out of his house much, and he didn't seem like the friendliest person. The party kicked off at around 5 to 7. It basically consisted of kids racing through the street, laughing while adults chatted over drinks. I was helping my husband flip burgers when I noticed Mr. Grayson walking around the perimeter of the gathering, hands in his pockets, observing quietly. A few neighbors waved at him, but he didn't give a wave back. It was strange how he seemed to drift from one edge of the party to another, always just outside of the main group of people and never coming in it for food or to talk to anyone. Every once in a while, I'd check to see what Mr. Grayson was up to. He seemed to always be near the area where the kids were playing, just standing awkwardly in the shadows. When it got dark, the party shifted to the backyard where we had a string of lights hung up. The atmosphere was lively, and we lit a fire pit to roast marshmallows. But Mr. Grayson had disappeared again. I didn't see him for a while until I noticed him near the back of his house, just standing in his yard. Later that evening, I noticed Mr. Grayson was in the backyard, standing too close to where the kids were playing. It was so strange. Throughout the rest of the night, he kept disappearing back to his house and yard, and then reappearing back closer to the party, but always near where the kids were playing. I finally had a free moment from hosting and decided to go over and talk to Mr. Grayson, hoping to invite him to more of the heart of the party. I asked him if everything was okay and if he wanted to come sit by the fire pit. He tilted his head and an unsettling smile creeped across his face. He said he was fine and, quote, was just enjoying the fun from afar. They seemed to have so much energy. Before I could respond, he turned and walked back towards his house, disappearing into the darkness. The rest of that evening, he would pop in and out of view, lurking in the shadows, never quite leaving, but never fully engaging. In my mind, it was a strange night, but he might have had good intentions and was just a strange person. A couple of years later, however, he got arrested for possession of some very bad and inappropriate content. I can't help but always think back to that night and how creepy he was being. But at least, he only ever watched and didn't try to take any physical action towards the kids.